The mirror's lie. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, her reflection staring back with eyes that held no recognition of beauty. At 26, she had mastered the art of disappearing, not physically, but emotionally. She dressed in muted colors, spoke in whispered apologies, and carried herself as though taking up space was a burden to the world. Her childhood had been a collection of small wounds. "You're not as pretty as your sister," an aunt had casually mentioned at a family gathering. "Why can't you be more like Tom?" Her father would sigh when report cards arrived, comparing her B's to her brother's A's. These were not malicious attacks. They were thoughtless comments that landed like seeds in fertile soil, growing into tangled vines of self-doubt that choked her confidence. Low self-esteem was not just thinking poorly of herself. It was a lens through which she viewed every interaction, every opportunity, every relationship. When her boss praised her work, Sarah heard only what was not said, convinced he was being polite rather than genuine. When friends invited her out, she declined, certain they'd have more fun without her awkward presence weighing them down. The cruelest part was how invisible it made her feel. She had become an expert at reading rooms, sensing moods, anticipating others' needs, anything to avoid being a burden. She apologized constantly for speaking, for existing, for breathing too loudly in quiet spaces. Her worth had become contingent on others' approval, a currency she could never earn enough of because the exchange rate was determined by a broken internal calculator. At work, she watched less qualified colleagues receive promotions she deserved but never asked for. The thought of advocating for herself felt presumptuous, like claiming a prize she had not earned. When her friend Emma asked why she never pursued the marketing position she'd mentioned wanting, Sarah offered a practiced smile and said, "I do not think I'm quite ready yet." The truth was, she did not believe she'd ever be ready. Low self-esteem had convinced her that readiness was a destination she was fundamentally incapable of reaching. The breaking point, the unraveling, began on a Tuesday, unremarkable except for its ordinariness. Sarah's boyfriend of 3 years, Marcus, sat across from her at their favorite coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's like loving a ghost. You're here, but you're not really here." His words should have devastated her, but instead, they landed with the dull thud of confirmation. Of course he was leaving. She'd been waiting for it, expecting it, almost orchestrating it with her constant need for reassurance, her inability to accept love without suspicion. "I knew you'd realize eventually," she whispered, and the resignation in her voice seemed to frustrate him more than sadness would have. "That's exactly what I mean, Sarah. You've already decided you're not worth loving, so nothing I say or do matters. I'm exhausted from trying to convince you of something you refuse to believe." He left money for both their coffees. Even in leaving, he was kinder than she thought she deserved. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah did something she had not done in years. She allowed herself to feel angry. Not at Marcus, but at the voice in her head that had narrated her life with such cruelty. She thought about all the opportunities she'd declined, the friendships she'd sabotaged with her neediness, the dreams she'd abandoned before even trying because failure seemed inevitable. Low self-esteem, she realized, was not just a lack of confidence. It was an active form of self-betrayal. Every time she silenced her opinions to avoid conflict, every time she accepted less than she deserved, every time she apologized for existing, she was confirming the lie that she was somehow fundamentally defective. She had spent years gathering evidence for a case against herself, and she'd become both prosecutor and judge in a trial where the verdict was predetermined. The anger gave way to something unexpected: curiosity. What would life look like if she questioned the voice instead of obeying it? What if the narrative she'd accepted about herself wasn't truth but trauma, not fact but learned fiction? The uncomfortable journey, change didn't arrive with fanfare. It began with small, uncomfortable acts of rebellion against her own mind. Sarah started a journal, not to catalog her failures as she'd done before, but to challenge her thoughts. When the voice whispered, "You're not good enough," she wrote, "Where's the evidence?" and forced herself to find counterexamples. She joined a therapist named Dr. Chun, a woman whose office smelled like lavender and whose patience seemed infinite. Low self-esteem is often a protection mechanism, Dr. Chun explained during their third session. If you expect the worst from yourself, You think you're protecting yourself from disappointment, but you're actually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The work was exhausting. Dr. Chun assigned exercises that felt impossible. Speaking up in meetings, setting boundaries with her mother, who still made casual comparisons to her sister, writing down 3 things she did well each day. That last one was torture. I made coffee, Sarah wrote the first day, feeling ridiculous. But Dr. Chun insisted competence in small things mattered, too. Sarah started noticing patterns. Her low self-esteem had trained her to be hyper-vigilant to others' emotions while completely ignoring her own. She could tell when a colleague was having a bad day from the way they held their coffee cup, but she couldn't identify her own feelings until they exploded into anxiety or collapsed into numbness. She'd become fluent in everyone's language except her own. The breakthrough came during a team meeting when her manager asked for ideas on a struggling campaign. Sarah had a solution. She'd thought about it for days, but her mouth would not open. The familiar paralysis set in. Someone else will say it better. You'll sound stupid. Wait for someone smarter to speak. But then she heard Dr. Chen's voice. What if you're wrong about being wrong? Her hand raised before she could stop it. I have an idea, she said, her voice shaking but audible. She presented her strategy, watching faces around the table for signs of ridicule that never came. Instead, her manager nodded thoughtfully. That's actually brilliant, Sarah. Let's develop that further. The victory was small but seismic. She'd survived speaking up. The world had not ended. She hadn't been exposed as a fraud. Maybe, just maybe, her internal narrative was unreliable. The new foundation. 6 months later, Sarah barely recognized the person in the mirror, not because she looked different, but because she was finally looking with kinder eyes. Low self-esteem hadn't vanished. She'd learned it was a wound that might never fully heal, but she'd developed tools to manage it, to question it, to refuse its tyranny. She'd been promoted to senior analyst, a position she'd actually applied for after weeks of fighting the voice that said she was not qualified. During the interview, when asked about her weaknesses, she'd been honest. I sometimes doubt myself more than I should, but I've learned that my self-doubt isn't always accurate. I've built systems to double-check my assumptions about my capabilities against actual evidence. Her relationship with Emma had deepened now that Sarah could be present without constantly seeking reassurance. You seem lighter, Emma observed over lunch. Like you're not carrying something invisible anymore. Sarah smiled. I'm still carrying it, she admitted. But I've learned it's not the truth. It's just weight, and weight can be set down, even if just for moments at a time. She'd even started dating again, though carefully. The difference was that she no longer saw relationships as validation of her worth, but as a choice 2 people made to share their lives. When a date did not call back, instead of spiraling into self-blame, she thought, maybe we were not compatible, and moved forward. The most profound shift was internal. Sarah had learned that low self-esteem was a liar, but a convincing one because it used her own voice. It took her fears, her past hurts, her moments of genuine failure, and wove them into a story of inherent inadequacy. But she'd learned to be a better editor of her own narrative. She still had hard days when the old voice grew loud, when she wanted to disappear again, when self-doubt felt like gravity pulling her down. But now she had something she'd never had before, evidence of her own resilience, a growing collection of moments when she'd been wrong about being worthless. Low self-esteem had taught her she was small, but recovery was teaching her something more important, that she was capable of growth, worthy of kindness, and deserving of the space she occupied in the world. The journey wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about becoming real.